I am Emily, and I was 35 years old the night my biological mother looked me dead in the eye at my own graduation dinner and told me in front of everyone that she wished I'd never been born. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I just sat up straight, smoothed down my dress, and calmly told them to act like I didn't exist anymore. I told them that moving forward, they should live the rest of their lives as if they never had a daughter named Emily. The entire restaurant went dead silent, everyone at the table freezing in place. And before that night was over, I watched federal agents slap handcuffs on my brother-in-law and lead him away, right as I officially launched foreclosure proceedings on my parents' luxury estate. Before we dive into how it all went down, I just want to say, if you've ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life for good, you'll know exactly how this feels. That night started at a premier top-tier steakhouse in downtown Atlanta. It was the kind of high-end, highly exclusive spot where getting a reservation usually took months of planning. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over heavy, crisp white linen tablecloths, and the floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. I arrived early to make sure everything was set up perfectly. As a 35-year-old African-American woman, I'd spent the last 3 grueling years working my fingers to the bone to earn my executive MBA. I paid every single cent of that tuition out of my own pocket. I spent countless nights staring at my laptop screen until my eyes went blurry, giving up all my weekends and social life just to build an ironclad future for myself in a cutthroat business world. That evening, I wore a tailored emerald green dress that made me feel powerful and deeply accomplished. I was extraordinarily proud of myself, but in the family I grew up in, my pride was never allowed to take up space. My parents, Winston and Valerie, lived a very comfortable, upper-middle-class wealthy lifestyle, but their affection was a strictly controlled currency, and every last bit of it was lavished exclusively as my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was the undisputed golden child. She was outgoing, lived a flashy, lavish lifestyle, and my parents paraded her around their social circles like a prized trophy. I was the quiet scapegoat. I preferred sitting in a corner reading books over pageants, and my achievements were always minimized, if not outright ignored. Tonight was supposed to be my moment of recognition. For years, I had kept my true financial situation and business accomplishments completely hidden from them. In their eyes, I was just a transparent, mid-level corporate drone barely scraping by. They had no idea I was actually the founder of a massive venture capital firm. I knew all too well that if they ever found out about my wealth, they would bleed me dry to fund Chloe and her husband, Connor. Connor was a wealthy white guy running a polished, flashy tech startup. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on, believing that bringing a white tech founder into the family elevated our status in Atlanta's high society. My family showed up 30 minutes late to my graduation dinner. They didn't even bother to apologize for keeping me waiting. My mother, Valerie, walked in wearing a showy custom designer gown, desperate to make sure all eyes were on her. My father, Winston, followed close behind, sweeping the room with a critical gaze as if judging whether the venue met his elite standards. Chloe and Connor sauntered in last, laughing loudly and instantly drawing stares from other diners. The moment Chloe sat down, she made a point of slamming her brand-new, limited-edition designer handbag onto the table so everyone could clearly see the expensive logo. There were no warm hugs, no proud smiles celebrating my major milestone. Instead, the second my mother sat down, she looked me up and down and let out a heavy sigh. She demanded to know why I was wearing green, claiming it made my skin tone look dull, and then scolded me for not spending more effort styling my hair for such a high-end restaurant. I swallowed the bitterness in my throat and forced a polite smile. I kept reminding myself that this was my celebration, and I wasn't going to let her ruin it. The maitre d' led us to our table, a prime spot right by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The waiter pulled out our chairs and handed us heavy, leather-bound menus. But before we could even order a drink, the passive-aggressive commentary began. Connor leaned back, unbuttoning his expensive custom suit jacket, and complained loudly about the downtown traffic. Orch. Then he looked at me with a condescending smirk and asked how my little night school classes went. He intentionally used the word little, trying to minimize the intense, highly selective MBA program I had just completed. I calmly explained to him that I had officially graduated today with top honors. Chloe just rolled her eyes, pulled out her phone, and completely tuned me out. Orch. My father, Winston, grumbled that going back to school at my age was a financially reckless move. He told me I should focus on finding a husband instead of collecting pieces of paper that meant nothing in the real world. I maintained my composure flawlessly, politely ordered a sparkling water from the waiter, and focused my attention on the menu. Orch. Once the waiter took our drink orders and walked away, the conversation shifted completely away from me. My mother clasped her hands together and leaned in toward Chloe. She transformed instantly, switching to that sweet, honeyed tone she reserved only for my sister. She began asking Chloe about the latest progress on her home renovations. Orch. For the next 45 minutes, the entire table sat captivated as Chloe rambled on about the imported Italian marble she had selected for her master bathroom. My mother gushed over Chloe's exquisite taste, praising her design choices and talking about how proud she was to have a daughter with such refined style. Orch. My father chimed in, nodding along proudly, as he bragged about how much those luxury upgrades would boost the market valuation of their suburban estate. Connor sat there looking smug, throwing his arm around Chloe's shoulders, and promising my parents that he only wanted to provide the absolute best for his beautiful wife. Orch. I sat there in silence, picking at my salad, feeling like a ghost at my own celebration. I had just finished a grueling academic journey, sacrificing countless nights to earn a prestigious degree to secure my future. But to my family, selecting bathroom tiles was a far greater, more historic achievement than my graduation. Orch. I tried to interject a few times, hoping to briefly share my final capstone project and bring the focus back to why we were all gathered there tonight. But every time I started to speak, my mother cut me off without hesitation. She would raise her voice to talk over me, either turning to call the waiter for more bread or making dramatic comments about what someone across the room was wearing. Orch. It was a calculated, intentional effort. She was going out of her way to completely erase my presence at my own dinner. When the main courses arrived, the food looked like a work of art, but it tasted like ash to me. The emotional toll of their blatant disregard sat like a heavy weight in my stomach. As the main plates were cleared, my mother picked up her crystal glass. Orch. She tapped it lightly with a small silver spoon, the crisp, clinking sound cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant and causing several nearby tables to turn and look. My mother stood up, elegantly smoothing out her expensive gown. She effortlessly captured the entire table's attention. For a brief, fleeting second, a small ember of hope flickered deep inside me. Orch. I thought that maybe, just maybe, she was finally going to acknowledge my hard work. I thought she was standing up to raise a glass to my graduation. I couldn't have been more wrong. My mother flashed a warm smile and raised her glass directly toward my sister Chloe. She cleared her throat and began her speech. Orch. She announced that she wanted to take this special moment to celebrate real success and family excellence. She spoke about how incredibly proud she was of Chloe, praising her for building such a beautiful home with Connor, maintaining such an elegant lifestyle, and being the most perfect, shining example of a daughter. Orch. She went on and on about Chloe, amplifying every shallow, material detail of her life as if they were groundbreaking, historic achievements. Chloe beamed, soaking up the praise like a sponge. Connor smirked, raising his glass in agreement, while my father nodded solemnly. his eyes fixed entirely on my sister. Porch. I sat there, my hands gripping the silk napkin in my lap so tightly, my knuckles turned white, feeling a cold numbness spread through my veins. The blatant disrespect was suffocating. My mother was actively using my graduation dinner to step on my dignity just to elevate her golden child. Then, my mother slowly turned her gaze toward me. Porch. The warmth in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Her fake smile completely collapsed. She let out an exaggerated sigh, a dramatic gesture meant to broadcast deep exhaustion and profound disappointment to everyone listening. She lowered her glass slightly and laid into me right in front of the entire table and anyone nearby within earshot. Porch. She said she guessed she should mention my little milestone while we were here. She called my graduation an embarrassingly late accomplishment, claiming that a 35-year-old woman going back to school was proof that I had failed to establish myself as a normal adult in my 20s. Porch. She ruthlessly criticized my independent choices, framing my quiet, low-profile lifestyle as an ongoing embarrassment to the family name. The venom in her tone was undeniable. This wasn't tough love from a parent. It was an enemy going in for blood. She locked eyes with me and delivered the final blow. Porch. Honestly, Emily, she said bitterly, given all the headaches and trouble you've caused us by refusing to follow the path we laid out for you, we really just wish you had never been born. I didn't cry. I didn't flip the table. I slowly pushed my chair back, stood up, and smoothed out the front of my emerald green dress. Porch. Then I looked straight back at my mother and spoke in a voice that was completely flat, calm, and steady. Then act like I don't exist. From this moment on, live the rest of your lives as if you never had a daughter named Emily. With that, I calmly sat back down and adjusted my napkin. A dead silence fell over the table, heavy and suffocating. Porch. The clinking of silverware from neighboring tables sounded deafening in the eerie stillness. I picked up my knife and fork, slowly cutting a piece of steak and taking my time to savor it, while my family stared at me like I had just grown a second head. My mother remained standing, her mouth slightly agape, her mind clearly unable to process my total refusal to surrender. Porch. She had been waiting for me to break, to apologize, or to run out of the restaurant in tears. As I sat there chewing with a serene smile, the strange spell was finally broken. The first person to speak up wasn't my mother. It was Chloe's husband, Connor. Connor shifted in his chair, his broad frame pressing heavily against the white linen tablecloth. Porch. He was a man who radiated unearned confidence, wearing a custom navy suit no doubt financed by my parents. He let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. He looked at me with the smug superiority that only belongs to someone who has never faced real adversity in their entire life. Slowly shaking his head, he told me it was ridiculous for me to throw such a dramatic tantrum over a cute little diploma. Porch. He even used hand gestures to make quotation marks in the air when he said diploma, doing everything he could to belittle the massive milestone I had just achieved. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, Emily," he sneered, "sitting in a classroom a couple of nights a week with mid-level managers doesn't automatically make you a business mogul." Porch. "Frankly, thinking a few outdated textbooks give you the right to disrespect your mother like this is pathetic." In Connor's mind, someone like me completely lacked the cultural background to understand how real power worked at the top of corporate America. He lectured me, saying that true power wasn't printing a certificate and putting it in a cheap wooden frame. Porch. True power was about capital, leverage, aggressive networking, and an innate ability to control the room. He smirked and added that a woman struggling in total obscurity like me would never comprehend high-level wealth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't back down. I simply set my fork down elegantly and rested my hands on the edge of the table. Porch. I looked at Connor, taking in the arrogant tilt of his chin and the expensive, flashy watch on his wrist. Watching such an ignorant, laughable man lecture me about capital and leverage was absolute comedy. In a tone that was completely smooth and steady, I asked him, "So, does true power mean relying entirely on your father-in-law to fund your luxurious lifestyle?" Arch. The words cut through the air like a razor-sharp scalpel. Chloe gasped, clutching her chest in shock. Connor's face instantly turned a deep, furious red as his smug smile vanished, replaced by a stiff, defensive glare. Before Connor could figure out how to counter, my father exploded. Winston slammed his heavy hand down onto the table with stunning force. The loud boom made the crystal glasses rattle, sending drops of red wine sloshing over the rims and staining the pristine white tablecloth. The sudden violence of the sound startled my mother, causing her to drop back into her chair. My father leaned forward, his deep-set eyes burning with a familiar, intimidating fury, the kind that used to terrify me when I was a helpless child. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. He ordered me to apologize to Valerie immediately. He called my behavior utterly disgraceful, accusing me of intentionally ruining the evening. He yelled that I was an ungrateful child who had zero respect for the parents who gave her life. I looked right back at my father, refusing to back down or flinch from his overbearing glare. I asked him simply, what exactly was I supposed to be grateful for? That simple question seemed to send him into a deeper rage. Completely ignoring the worried restaurant staff hovering nearby, he raised his voice even further. He reminded me that when I was 18, he generously offered me a stable position at his logistics firm. He claimed he gave me a golden opportunity to learn the family business from the ground up, and that I had arrogantly thrown it back in his face. He called me stubborn and foolish for rejecting his guidance as an industry expert. In stark contrast to his mounting rage, my voice remained perfectly calm and steady. I reminded him that his logistics company was already failing back when I was a teenager. I told him I refused to tie my future to a sinking ship, steered by a man who refused to adapt to modern technology or update his business model. I reminded him that on the exact day I turned down his job offer, he cut me off financially without a second thought. I was 18 years old, forced to pack my few personal belongings into black trash bags because he told me that if I didn't work for his company, I didn't deserve to live under his roof. To pay the rent on a tiny apartment and put myself through undergrad while working, I had to balance 3 minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on. My father scoffed, waving a hand dismissively at my memories. He called it tough love. He claimed it was a necessary measure to teach me how the real world worked, insisting that I was so headstrong I would have ruined myself without a firm hand. I shifted my gaze to Chloe, who sat quietly sipping her champagne, perfectly comfortable letting the men fight her battles for her. I asked my father if tough love was also the reason he and my mother were willing to throw hundreds of thousands of dollars into funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle. Right there at the table, I laid out the indisputable facts, one by one. They were more than happy to cover Chloe's extravagant destination wedding in the Caribbean. They didn't hesitate to pay the massive down payment on her sprawling suburban home. Most importantly, every time Connor complained about cash flow issues, they funneled a continuous stream of money into his hollow tech startup. I called out their blatant, glaring hypocrisy as parents. Back when I was scraping together pennies for discounted cereal and college textbooks, they were fully funding Connor's entire existence. My mother tried to step in, her voice shaking with anger. She claimed Connor was legally family now, and that investing in his promising startup was a crucial investment in our collective future. She insisted Connor possessed a visionary mind that someone with my limited, low-level corporate background could never understand. Connor nodded along, puffing his chest out again as my mother defended his honor. He quickly recovered his arrogant demeanor, thoroughly enjoying how hard my parents were fighting to protect him against me. Connor let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through our dining area. Adjusting his silk tie, he looked down his nose at me. He said my jealousy was pathetic and sad to watch. He told me it was basic business logic for my parents to back a winner, rather than waste their hard-earned money on an older woman barely scraping together a basic degree. Orch. He claimed successful people recognized and supported other successful people. He suggested I was bitter and resentful, only because I had to do everything the hard way while he and Chloe shone effortlessly in higher social circles. Leaning back, he threw his arms out in a grand, dominant gesture. He told me I had nerve coming into a high-end restaurant acting like I owned the place. Orch. He declared that real power wasn't demanding respect with a bad attitude and a cheap dress. Real power was proving you belonged at the table with the elite. He added that someone like me was out of her depth trying to play a high-stakes game with people operating in an entirely different financial league. He wanted to humiliate me. Orch. He wanted to show my parents that he was the absolute alpha male at the table, the man who could put a rebellious, wayward daughter back in her place. I watched him closely, taking in every detail of his arrogant performance. It was a masterclass in fragile male ego and unearned privilege. He was so desperate to prove his superiority that his body was almost trembling with aggressive energy. Orch. I didn't interrupt his speech. I let him talk, letting him dig a deeper grave with every arrogant, boastful word that came out of his mouth. I knew down to the cent what my personal financial portfolio looked like, and I knew exactly how disastrous his real finances were. The massive gap between his confident facade and his grim reality was almost comedy. But he had absolutely no idea that I held all the internal data. Connor decided this was the perfect moment to teach me a brutal lesson about real power. He wanted a visual demonstration to highlight the massive gulf between my quiet, independent life and his supposed unlimited wealth. He wanted to crush my spirit in public and force me to submit to the family hierarchy once and for all. Orch. He smirked, his eyes locking onto mine with a dark, predatory intensity. He raised his right hand high in the air and snapped his fingers loudly. That sharp snap carried an aggressive authority, an insult gesture meant to summon the restaurant staff like obedient servants. Orch. He was preparing to deliver what he thought was the final financial blow, one that would put me in my place forever and remind me why I was the outcast of this family. The harsh sound of Connor's snap cut through the elegant restaurant once more. A waiter quickly rushed over to our table, looking noticeably tense. In his hand, he held a sleek black leather presenter containing the final bill. Orch. We had enjoyed multiple courses of prime dry-aged steaks, imported seafood, and several bottles of fine vintage wine that my parents had ordered without blinking. The waiter initially reached out to place the bill near my father, Winston, since he traditionally paid for these lavish family dinners to assert his status. But Connor intercepted it. Orch. Reaching out with a sense of unearned entitlement, he snatched the leather presenter right out of the waiter's hand. Connor flipped it open, his eyes scanning the printed receipt. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He checked the total amount and then looked straight at me, the malice in his eyes completely unhidden. Orch. He knew exactly what he was doing. Using money as a weapon to force my total submission. Connor snapped the bill presenter shut with a loud, deliberate thud. Instead of handing it back, he tossed it across the white tablecloth. It slid right onto my empty plate, landing with a dull thud that sounded harsh in the dead silence of our table. Orch. Leaning back, Connor crossed his arms over his custom suit jacket. He announced to the entire table that the final damage for the night came out to a crisp $4,500. He let that massive figure hang in the air, making sure everyone heard it loud and clear. Then he stared at me with pure venom. Orch. He said that since I was so determined to be independent, and now so highly educated, I should cover the entire cost of the celebration. He called it a family tax for my existence. He ordered me to pick up the tab, apologize to my mother for my disrespectful outburst, and get out of their sight. My mother, Valerie, raised no objections to this blatant financial bullying. Porch. In fact, she looked thrilled. Sitting up straighter, a cold, triumphant smile touched her lips. She had done the math. A standard corporate salary could barely handle daily expenses, let alone a sudden $4,500 dinner bill. She was waiting for the exact moment my composure broke. Chloe leaned into Connor, resting a hand on his shoulder and giggling at her husband's power move. Porch. They formed an arrogant front, thoroughly enjoying the prospect of watching me fall into a financial trap. They expected me to panic. They wanted to watch me stare at the massive bill, break down, and realize that without draining my modest savings, I couldn't pay it. Connor's presence in our family was a masterclass in unearned privilege. Porch. My parents practically bowed down to him, treating his failing startup like the second coming of Silicon Valley. He used his background like a blunt instrument, and tonight he was swinging it straight at me to protect his wife. He was far too comfortable in a space that wasn't his, acting as if he were the ultimate gatekeeper of success. Porch. My father, Winston, a man who built his own logistics business from the ground up, should have been offended by his son-in-law's arrogance. But he was so obsessed with the illusion of social status through Connor that he allowed his own daughter to be publicly humiliated. It was a sad testament to how broken our family dynamic really was. I looked around at the relatives sitting with us. Porch. My aunt and uncle shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. They stared at their half-empty wine glasses or studied their napkins. Not a single person stood up for me. No one pointed out how absurd it was to force a 35-year-old woman to pay an astronomical bill as a punishment. They were too afraid of crossing my parents and losing access to the family's resources. Porch. Their silent compliance allowed my brother-in-law to humiliate me in public, simply because I refused to play the role of the failure they assigned to me. My father just crossed his arms, staring at me with a stern, unforgiving glare, waiting for me to pull out a debit card and face inevitable embarrassment. It was pure psychological warfare. Porch. They wanted to remind me that no matter how many degrees I earned, I would never have the capital to sit at their level. They wanted to prove that my quiet hustle was worthless compared to their lavish, parent-funded lifestyle. I looked down at the black leather bill sitting on my plate. Porch. I remembered the years I spent wearing thrifted clothes and eating cheap instant noodles just to pay my college tuition, while my parents bought Chloe brand new luxury cars. I remembered the endless nights I was pushed aside, belittled, and treated like a financial burden just for existing. Porch. Connor took it a step further, suggesting that if my modest bank account couldn't handle the sudden hit, I could set up a payment plan with the restaurant. He let out an arrogant laugh that made my blood boil, telling the waiter to stand by and make sure the transaction actually cleared, claiming he doubted my credit limit could cover their expensive taste. Porch. The waiter looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight and clearly wishing he could disappear. He kept his eyes down, an unwilling witness to this harsh family drama. Clearing his throat nervously, the waiter gently broke the heavy silence. He politely asked if I would like to split the bill evenly across the table. Connor instantly glared at him, barking a sharp warning. Porch. He snapped that under no circumstances was the bill to be split. He reiterated that, to make up for my rude attitude, I had to cover the entire cost myself. An aunt sitting 2 seats down let out a faint gasp, but quickly covered her mouth and looked down. The sheer cowardice of my extended family was just as frustrating as the direct attacks from my mother and brother-in-law. They were happy to enjoy expensive cuts of beef, yet wouldn't offer a single word of support when the person being celebrated was subjected to financial extortion. Chloe whispered something to Connor, and they shared a smirk. Then she looked at me and said that maybe I should think twice before hosting a dinner I couldn't afford, rather than ruining her mood. She added that real adults know how to pay for their mistakes. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was a woman who had never paid a utility bill with her own earned money, living in a house fully funded by my parents, and driving a car paid for by investors in her husband's startup. Yet she sat there passing moral judgment on my financial worth. Ouch. The tension in the room reached an absolute breaking point. The silence was so heavy it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My mother leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation, waiting for the moment I surrendered. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to ask my father for help, to admit I couldn't handle it, and to plead for their financial rescue. Ouch. If I did that, they would hold it over me forever. For the rest of my life, they would bring up this dinner as absolute proof that my independence was just a sad illusion. I took a deep breath, letting the cool restaurant air fill my lungs. The situation was almost laughable. They truly believed a $4,500 bill was the ultimate weapon to destroy me. Ouch. They assumed that whatever mid-level job they imagined I had, my salary would be completely wiped out by a single meal. They wanted me to leave with an empty bank account and a broken spirit, waking up tomorrow, anxious about rent and groceries. Just like the scared 18-year-old girl they kicked out years ago. But I was no longer that terrified teenager, desperate for their approval. Ouch. I was a 35-year-old woman who had forged her own path in high finance on her own terms. I had gone head-to-head with aggressive board executives, thwarted hostile takeover attempts, and navigated cold corporate negotiations. Connor's little temper tantrum and my mother's petty tactics were nothing compared to the real battles I fought and won every single day. Ouch. I looked down at the black leather bill folder on my plate. I reached out and gently touched its smooth surface with the tips of my fingers. The leather felt cool against my skin. I slowly raised my head and surveyed the faces around the table, one by one. I looked at my mother, Valerie. She had this fake smile plastered on her face, masking a deep, bitter insecurity and sheer malice. Ouch. I looked at my father, Winston, his arms tightly crossed, acting as the silent enforcer of this family's toxic rules. I looked at my sister, Chloe, whose entire identity depended on the money and validation provided by the people sitting beside her. And finally, I looked at Connor, the arrogant clown who had orchestrated this pathetic financial ambush. I didn't flinch. I didn't break a sweat. Ouch. I didn't let a single trace of fear show on my face. That icy composure that had settled over me earlier only grew stronger. I felt an incredible surge of power rushing through my veins, because I knew something none of them could even dream of. I looked at the bill holder, then raised my eyes to meet Connor's smug, insufferable face. Ouch. I reached for the empty chair next to me and slowly picked up my designer clutch. It was a custom piece, understated yet ridiculously expensive, which my mother, despite her self-proclaimed exquisite taste, had completely failed to recognize. I unclasped the lock with a sharp metallic click that echoed through the quiet dining room. Ouch. Staring straight into Connor's eyes, I let a genuine smile bloom on my lips. "You're right, Connor," I said, my voice perfectly steady and full of confidence. "An education is extremely expensive. Let's see what mine actually bought me." I slowly pulled my hand from the silk lining of my clutch. I didn't pull out a standard debit card, nor a basic corporate card with the embarrassing credit limit. Ouch. Instead, I withdrew a heavy piece of solid anodized titanium. It was a matte black American Express Centurion card. The black card. This wasn't something you could simply apply for online or secure with a decent corporate salary. It was an invitation-only symbol of status reserved strictly for the ultra-high net worth individual. Ouch. To hold this particular piece of metal, your annual spending and payoff had to reach millions of dollars. It represented massive liquid wealth and absolute financial dominance. I held it between my index and middle fingers, letting the light from the massive crystal chandelier catch its subtle, dark metallic sheen. Ouch. With a deliberate, slow movement, I extended my arm and pressed the heavy titanium card directly onto the center of the leather bill folder Connor had so aggressively thrown onto my plate earlier. The card hit the leather with a distinct heavy thud. In the suffocating silence at our table, That sound was deafening. Orch. Through all of this, I didn't break eye contact with my brother-in-law for a single second. I stared fixedly at his face, waiting for his brain to process the visual information right under his nose. Connor was a tech startup founder, a man obsessively consumed by wealth, capital, and elite status symbols. Orch. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that he would immediately recognize what I had just placed on the table. It took a full 3 seconds for reality to crash through him. I watched the arrogance and smugness literally melt off his face. It was as if someone had pulled an invisible plug, draining away every drop of his unearned confidence in an instant. Orch. His jaw dropped, his mouth hung open, and his eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at that matte black card as if it were a venomous snake that had just slithered onto the white linen tablecloth. The posture he had maintained all evening to assert his aggressive dominance suddenly collapsed. Orch. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly as his brain frantically tried to calculate how his supposedly struggling sister-in-law could possibly hold the most exclusive financial instrument in the world. He knew very well that the initiation fee alone for this card was more than most people earned in an entire year. He knew the annual spend requirement to keep it was an astronomical figure. Orch. When he realized the level of capital I commanded completely dwarfed his fragile, venture-backed startup funds, the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and looking suddenly small in his expensive tailored suit. He tried to swallow, but his throat had gone completely dry. Orch. Chloe, sitting next to him, felt the sudden drastic shift in his energy. She looked at her husband, her neatly manicured eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. She glanced down at the table and saw the black card pressed against the bill. To Chloe, it was just a piece of black metal. She lacked basic financial literacy and couldn't grasp the massive significance behind it. Orch. Impatiently, she tugged at Connor's sleeve and asked what was wrong. She asked why he was staring at my card like he'd seen a ghost. She let out a nervous laugh, urging him to just get the server to run the card so they could finally watch my bank balance drop and put an end to this scene. Connor didn't answer her. He couldn't even find the strength to speak. Orch. He just stared at the titanium card, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming shift in power dynamics between us. My father, Winston, leaned forward in his chair, narrowing his deep-set eyes. He noticed Connor's sudden dead silence, and it deeply unsettled him. Winston was used to Connor being the loudest, most confident man in the room. Orch. Seeing his proud golden son-in-law reduced to a speechless, gaping statue made Winston thoroughly uncomfortable. He sternly demanded to know what was going on. He ordered me to stop playing childish games, pay the bill as I was told, and bring this embarrassing family display to an end. My mother, Valerie, also sensed that the atmosphere was deteriorating at a terrifying speed. Orch. Her triumphant, cruel smile began to falter. Her eyes darted between Connor's pale face and my perfectly calm expression, desperately trying to understand how I had managed to silence the man they virtually worshipped. She sat up straight, nervously clutching her napkin, acutely aware that her carefully planned public humiliation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Orch. She opened her mouth, ready to unleash another round of venomous insults. But the words died in her throat when she caught my eye. There was no fear in my gaze, no submission. I was watching them all with a cool, ruthless detachment, like a predator observing trapped prey. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw our server approaching the table. Orch. His steps were brisk yet hesitant, clearly bracing himself for an extremely awkward and potentially volatile interaction. He had witnessed the aggressive exchange earlier. He had seen Connor snatch the bill and throw it at me. He was fully expecting to pick up a basic, standard card and return a few minutes later to discreetly inform me of insufficient funds. Orch. He stopped at our table, politely averting his eyes to avoid staring at the obvious tension. He reached out his hand, preparing to take the leather bill holder to settle the check. Just as his hand hovered over the table, his eyes landed on the heavy, matte black titanium card resting on the printed receipt. I watched his entire posture transform in a fraction of a second. His training as a high-end restaurant professional instantly kicked in. Establishments at this level train their staff rigorously on how to recognize and serve ultra-high net worth clients. This server knew exactly what a Centurion card represented. He knew he was standing before a VIP whose net worth commanded flawless, uncompromising service. The server snapped his hand back, as if he had almost committed an unforgivable mistake. He stood up straight, smoothed the front of his crisp apron, and offered a deep, respectful bow. The nervousness he had carried a moment ago evaporated, replaced by profound reverence. When he spoke, his voice was hushed and deeply respectful, stammering slightly. He addressed me directly as ma'am, completely ignoring Connor, my father, and my mother. He asked if dinner tonight had met my absolute satisfaction. He even asked if there was anything else the executive chef or the kitchen could prepare for me before settling the check. My distant relatives watched this interaction in absolute stunned silence. The aunts and uncles who had refused to stand up for me earlier were now staring at the server with wide, incredulous eyes. All evening they had watched this same server treat my parents with polite distance. Now, he was addressing me with a deep humility usually reserved for royalty. A level of respect my parents and Connor couldn't buy with all their loud bragging and expensive orders. The visual contrast was striking. The staff was bestowing the highest level of courtesy upon the quiet, scapegoated daughter, while completely ignoring the loud, arrogant family members who had tried to humiliate her just minutes prior. Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving nervously up and down. He opened his mouth to speak, attempting to reclaim some shred of authority in this unraveling situation, but no words came out. The harsh reality of his own financial insignificance was like an invisible hand squeezing his throat. He had tried to use a $4,500 dinner bill to crush my spirit and prove his superiority. Instead, he had inadvertently built the perfect stage for me to reveal that my capital could swallow his entire, so-called empire without making a ripple. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life there was genuine raw fear in his eyes. He realized he had walked into a trap he didn't even know existed. The server stepped forward respectfully, reaching out once more to carefully take the titanium card and the bill folder. He assured me he would handle the transaction personally and return the card immediately. He promised not to keep me waiting for a single second. I let his fingers just graze the edge of the black folder, and at that exact moment, I made my move. I gracefully raised my right hand, stopping him with a single manicured finger. The server froze instantly, like a loyal soldier waiting for orders. I looked across the wide table, locking my eyes directly onto Connor's panicked face. I spoke, my voice remaining perfectly calm, but carrying the quiet, effortless authority of someone in total control. I told the server, "There's actually no need to run the card tonight." I gave him a slow, genuine smile and said, "Just put the entire bill on the owner's account." The server froze for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted from the heavy titanium card on the folder to my face. He swallowed hard, standing at attention out of pure professional respect. He bowed his head slightly and without a moment's hesitation accepted my quiet command. He softly replied that it was his absolute honor to handle it exactly as I requested. He didn't even touch the card. He simply picked up the black leather bill folder with both hands, bowed respectfully, and backed away from the table, hurrying toward the kitchen. The air at our table grew impossibly heavy. Connor let out a sharp, nervous laugh that sounded almost like a bark. He aggressively adjusted his position in his chair, tugging at his custom suit jacket, as if that physical gesture could somehow restore his shattered authority. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of deep confusion and rising anger. He demanded to know what kind of pathetic trick I was playing. Orch. He asked if I had met the restaurant owner at some night class, or if I was just playing dumb in front of everyone to dodge the bill. He confidently claimed that management would be out any second to expose my fake stunt and humiliate me publicly. My father, Winston, crossed his thick arms, his deep-set eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He ordered me to stop playing games immediately. Orch. He said I was embarrassing the family, and that he wouldn't tolerate an adult woman acting like a spoiled child in a fine dining restaurant. He reached for his wallet, fully intending to take control of the situation and pay the bill himself. He wanted to play the savior to maintain his status as the family's ultimate provider. I didn't stop him. Orch. I just watched him fumble with his leather wallet, keeping a serene, calm expression on my face. Before my father could pull out a card, a sudden commotion drew the attention of the entire dining room. The restaurant's general manager, an imposing gentleman in an immaculate tuxedo, was practically hurrying across the dining room floor. Orch. Right behind him were two senior servers carrying a silver bucket filled with ice, holding an extremely rare vintage champagne. The general manager walked right past my father. He walked right past Connor. He came straight to my side of the table and stopped with flawless, respectful composure. He offered a deep bow, his face beaming with professional reverence. Orch. He addressed me directly by my name, his voice easily carrying across the silent table. He sincerely thanked me for honoring his restaurant with my presence tonight. Apologetically, he mentioned he hadn't received advance notice of my arrival, explaining that had he known I was bringing my family, he would have personally ensured the private dining area was reserved exclusively for us. Orch. He gestured to the vintage champagne, explaining it was a small token of endless appreciation for our continued partnership. Connor snorted loudly, his face turning a dark red. He leaned forward, harshly demanding to know why the general manager of a world-class steakhouse was treating me like royalty. Orch. Pointing an accusing finger straight at my face, Connor aggressively asserted that there had to be a huge misunderstanding. He claimed I was just a mid-level employee who couldn't even afford the appetizers on the menu. He insisted the manager bring the bill back so he could pay it and end this absurd farce. The general manager slowly turned to face Connor. Orch. The deep respect he had shown me vanished instantly. He looked at my brother-in-law with the cold, polite disdain high-end service professionals reserve for loud, arrogant individuals who have no idea how real wealth operates. Clearly and confidently, the general manager stated that there was absolutely no misunderstanding. Orch. He explained to Connor that the woman he was addressing was the absolute owner of the entire commercial building they were currently sitting in. Everyone at the table stopped breathing. The fork dropped from Chloe's hand, clattering loudly against her porcelain plate, but she didn't even blink. My father froze, his hand still gripping his wallet, his mouth slightly open in utter disbelief. Orch. My mother, Valerie, looked as though the blood had been violently drained from her body. I smiled gently at the manager and thanked him for the beautiful bottle of champagne. I told him he was doing a wonderful job running the establishment and that I was very pleased with the revenue reports his team had submitted last quarter. Orch. I casually mentioned that my holding company was looking forward to renewing their commercial lease for another 10 years, as I deeply valued tenants who understood the importance of flawless execution. The general manager bowed again, thanked me for my generosity, and discreetly excused himself, leaving my family gasping for air in the devastating reality of what had just been revealed. Orch. I turned my attention back to the table, resting my hands lightly on the white tablecloth. I looked straight at Connor. Orch. In a slow, methodical voice, I explained that he didn't just have a cute little corporate job. On the contrary, while he and my parents were busy showing off in the suburbs and burning through money to maintain their flashy fake image over the past decade, I had been quietly building an empire. I told him that my private real estate holding company owned this entire commercial block. I owned the luxury retail spaces on the ground floor, the boutique fitness center next door, and the thousands of square feet occupied by this top-tier steakhouse. I watched this crushing truth hit my family like a tidal wave. The $4,500 dinner bill Connor had tried to use to crush my spirit was a joke compared to the monthly commercial rent I collected from this single property. I didn't just have enough money to pay some ridiculous family tax. I had enough liquid capital to buy out his entire existence 100 times over. Their psychological warfare had completely backfired. The arrogant hierarchy they had built to keep me at the bottom of the family ladder crumbled into a million unsalvageable pieces right before their eyes. My father looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His entire identity was tied to being the wealthy, powerful patriarch. He had used his failing logistics company as an excuse to cut me off financially when I turned 18, telling me I would never survive in the real world without his money and guidance. Now, sitting in a luxury building, completely owned by the daughter he had cast aside, he was forced to realize that my achievements overshadowed his so completely that he was essentially a peasant sitting across from a queen. He slowly withdrew his hand from his wallet, his shoulders slumping in complete defeat. Predictably, the most nauseating reaction came from my mother. It was her signature, manipulative playbook. Once her brain fully grasped that the daughter she had always used as a scapegoat possessed generational wealth, her attitude did a violent U-turn. The cold, hateful glare that had accompanied her spiteful toast minutes ago vanished without a trace. Color rushed back to her face, and she forced a desperate, eager smile. She practically threw herself across the table, reaching out to grab my arm. Her voice instantly shifted back to the sweet sing-song tone she usually reserved only for Chloe. She gushed, calling me her sweet, beautiful baby girl. She let out a high-pitched, fake laugh, asking why I had kept such a wonderful secret from my own mother. She told me how immensely proud she was of the real estate empire I had built. She even had the audacity to suggest that my massive success was the direct result of her brilliant parenting. Looking around at the stunned aunts and uncles, she proudly announced to them that her tough love was what drove me to achieve greatness. She claimed she always knew I was destined for immense wealth, and that she only pushed me out of my comfort zone so I could reach my full potential. The sheer shamelessness was breathtaking. Less than 15 minutes ago, she had looked me dead in the eye and publicly declared she wished I had never been born. Now she was desperately trying to claim credit for the commercial empire I had built to escape her abuse. She held tightly to my arm, her eyes wide with greed. She told me we needed to schedule a private lunch right away so I could give her a full update on my commercial properties. She added that she would be more than happy to help manage my portfolio, because family must always protect family wealth. I looked down at her hand, clutching my arm. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just cold, clinical disgust. I slowly and deliberately pulled my arm from her grip. I didn't raise my voice, but my tone was sharp enough to slice through steel. I told her to shut her mouth. I told her not to dare rewrite history just because she discovered I was far wealthier than her golden girl. I repeated every single word of her vile toast back to her. I made it clear that my success belonged entirely to me, and that she would never see a single dime of it. My mother shrank back into her chair, her fake smile trembling violently as the reality of my absolute rejection set in. Chloe looked terrified, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life raft. She finally realized that her status as the family's wealthy, favored sister had just been permanently erased. Ignoring my mother's pathetic attempts to recover, I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. Connor was sweating profusely now. The collar of his custom suit suddenly seemed to be suffocating him. He stared at me like a man trapped on the tracks, watching a freight train barrel down on him at top speed. I offered a calm, chilling smile. Leaning forward, I rested my elbows on the table and laced my fingers together. I spoke directly to him, letting my voice carry clearly across the terrified family. "I don't just deal in real estate," I said smoothly. "George, you mentioned earlier that I lacked the background to understand real business, Connor. You said playing high-stakes games with elites like you was way out of my depth." "Fine," I said softly. "Let's play. Let's talk about your startup." The phrase hung in the air like an absolute threat. "Let's talk about your startup." I stared at Connor, watching the lethal weight of that invitation crush him. "George." His breathing became shallow and rapid. With a trembling hand, he reached for his glass, taking a large gulp of water in a desperate attempt to wet his dry throat. He was frantically trying to regain his footing, trying to reclaim the dominance he had wielded so arrogantly just 20 minutes ago. He set the glass down heavily on the white tablecloth. "George," he snorted, attempting to sound dismissive, but his voice was thin, stripped of all its former power. He told me my little real estate portfolio was completely irrelevant to the tech industry. He claimed that collecting commercial rent from restaurants and gyms was just a basic passive income strategy used by people who lacked the vision to disrupt global markets. I didn't interrupt him. "George." I let him talk, because every word coming out of his mouth only highlighted his incredible ignorance. He actually believed that owning this commercial block was the peak of my success. He was desperately trying to convince himself that I was just a lucky landlord who happened to stumble onto a profitable real estate deal. "George." My father, Winston, leaned forward slightly, his deep eyes darting between Connor and me. Winston understood the mechanics of wealth, even if his own logistics company was currently struggling. He knew that acquiring commercial property of this scale required massive capital and a flawless credit history. He knew it wasn't something an amateur could pull off. "George." Yet Winston was also desperately clinging to the family hierarchy he had built. He desperately wanted to believe that Connor was still the smartest man at the table. I reached into the plush lining of my designer bag. Bypassing my wallet and keys, I slid my fingertips across the cool, smooth glass screen of my iPad Pro. "George." I pulled the device out and laid it gently on the table, right next to the heavy matte black Centurion card. The screen was dark, reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandelier above. Chloe instinctively pulled away from her husband, staring at the tablet with a mix of deep unease and intense curiosity. "George." My mother remained completely silent, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, too terrified to imagine what else I was about to reveal. Having just been humiliated for failing to recognize my status, she certainly didn't want to invite another public embarrassment. I looked straight at Connor, my voice projecting the quiet, effortless authority of someone in total command of the narrative. "George." I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. Commercial real estate was indeed a basic passive income strategy. I explained that buying this building and the surrounding properties was merely a side project for me. A simple diversification strategy to park excess capital and generate a reliable monthly dividend. I called it a little hobby I picked up to pass the time on weekends. "George." Calling a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio a weekend hobby caused my father to gasp, nearly choking on his own breath. I placed my hands flat on the table on either side of the dark iPad screen. I explained to Connor that my real career, the business I had spent the last decade building from scratch, operated on a completely different level. "George." I told him I had intentionally hidden my true identity behind layers of non-disclosure agreements, proxy boards, and legal shields. In my industry, anonymity was the ultimate strategic advantage. It allowed me to evaluate business proposals and analyze desperate founders without my personal background interfering with cold market analysis. "George." I told him that while he was busy plastering his face all over social media and paying for shallow magazine interviews to pretend he was successful, I had been operating in the shadows, quietly controlling the flow of actual capital. Connor shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a deep, growing horror. Torch. As someone operating in the southeastern venture capital scene, he knew that there were unseen power players who held the lifelines of the entire regional economy. He was beginning to realize he might have spent the entire evening mocking the most dangerous one of them all. In a voice that could no longer hide its panic, he asked what it was I actually did. Torch. He demanded to know what kind of shadow shell company I was running to require so much secrecy. He desperately prayed I would name some mid-tier boutique firm that he could easily dismiss or mock. I didn't even blink. I held his terrified gaze, landing the knockout blow with surgical precision. I told him I was the sole founder and CEO of Apex Vanguard Venture Capital. Torch. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The name Apex Vanguard didn't just land on the table. It detonated like a bomb in Connor's mind. Winston recoiled, his back hitting his chair with a heavy thud. My father followed financial news obsessively. He knew exactly what Apex Vanguard was. Torch. It was one of the most ruthless, well-funded venture capital firms in the entire Southeast, famous for executing hostile takeovers and dismantling the careers of incompetent founders. The fact that his quiet, scapegoated daughter was the mastermind behind this financial titan completely shattered his worldview. But Connor's reaction was far worse. Torch. Every drop of blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, ghost-white pale. His jaw literally dropped, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He looked like a condemned man who had just been handed his execution order. He gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly, his knuckles turned white against his dark skin. He stopped breathing entirely. Torch. To him, the name Apex Vanguard represented a very specific, lethal terror. For the past 6 months, Connor had been aggressively and anonymously submitting funding proposals to Apex Vanguard, desperately begging for a massive Series C bailout. His flashy tech startup was burning through cash at an alarming rate. Torch. He had long since squandered his early investors' money to support the lavish lifestyle he shared with my sister. He had bought luxury sports cars and taken expensive vacations while his company collapsed behind the scenes. He knew that without an immediate injection of institutional capital, his entire facade would collapse, exposing him to severe legal consequences. Torch. He had been sending pleading emails, submitting heavily doctored business plans, practically begging the anonymous partners at Apex Vanguard to save his company and his freedom. Torch. He had no idea that the ruthless, anonymous CEO he had been begging for 6 months was the very woman he had spent the last hour tormenting over a dinner bill, calling her a failure, and demanding she submit to him financially. He had just spent an hour verbally abusing the person who held the absolute key to his survival, mocking her and trying to force her to her knees. Torch. Chloe's eyes darted wildly between her husband and me. Lacking basic business knowledge, she couldn't grasp the significance of the name Apex Vanguard, but she could clearly read the pure, unfiltered terror radiating from her husband. She grabbed Connor's arm, shaking him forcefully, demanding to know what was happening. She asked why he looked like he was about to be sick on the spot. Torch. Connor didn't dare look at his wife. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare created by his own arrogance. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. He was waiting for the final, lethal blow to land. I reached down slowly and hit the home button on my iPad Pro. The screen lit up instantly, casting a cold blue glow across my face. Torch. I entered my long, complex passcode to unlock the device, cutting straight through enterprise-grade encryption. Once inside, I opened a specific set of encrypted financial files that my forensic accounting team had finalized just a few weeks ago. Looking at the high-security data lined up neat and tidy in bright red columns, I couldn't help but smile. A cold, predatory smile. Torch. I looked over at Connor and told him that while his effort on the fundraising pitch was certainly persistent, his company's accounting was so full of holes it was almost laughable. I picked up the iPad, holding it firm, and slowly turned the glowing screen until it was facing my brother-in-law directly. Connor's eyes filled with pure panic as he stared at the crisp figures on the display. In ultra-high resolution, the iPad showed a set of disaster-level internal financial ledgers from his tech startup. A paper trail that exposed his complete financial ruin right in front of everyone at the dinner table. I adjusted the angle just right, making sure the glare from the heavy crystal chandelier didn't block a single line of text. I watched Connor's eyes dart wildly across the rows of glowing red numbers. The quiet in our private dining room was total. I didn't just show him the screen either. I started reading the figures out loud, my voice carrying clearly across the wide table, so every aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear the indisputable truth. I read off his startup's monthly cash burn, which was astronomical. I read the completely fabricated user acquisition metrics he'd used to scam his early investors, and I read the fake revenue projections he had the nerve to pitch to my partners at Apex Vanguard. With surgical mathematical precision, I publicly dismantled the inner workings of a dying company. Right before my eyes, Connor began to physically fall apart. The arrogant, hotshot tech founder, the guy who thought he could break my spirit over a $4,500 dinner bill, was suddenly in sweat. Heavy drops gathered on his forehead and tracked down his temples, soaking the collar of his ridiculously expensive custom suit. He opened his mouth to deny it, to claim the data was somehow made up. But the sheer level of detail on that screen made any defense look completely absurd. My forensic accountants had spent weeks tearing his sham of a business apart line by line. We had mapped every single bank account, every shell company, and every hidden transaction he thought was invisible. And I didn't stop at the corporate metrics. Smoothly, I swiped my finger across the glass, bringing up the second page of the confidential report. I looked straight at Chloe. That smug look on her face was completely gone, replaced by a mask of total confusion. I announced to the entire table that Connor wasn't just a terrible businessman running an empty shell of a startup. I announced that my firm's full audit had uncovered a massive, ongoing pattern of criminal embezzlement. I explained that Connor had been actively, systematically siphoning off millions in investor funds to personally finance his wife's absurdly lavish lifestyle. Chloe let out a sharp, ragged gasp that echoed in the quiet space. Keeping my eyes locked on her, I began listing the luxury assets sitting in her name, one by one. I detailed the 2 matte black Mercedes G-Wagons parked in the driveway of her suburban mansion. I pointed out her favorite current season designer handbags, including the obscenely pricey one, sitting right on our dinner table. I listed the 5-star vacations to the Maldives and the Amalfi Coast that she'd spent the last 3 years bragging about. I told her that not a single one of those things was legitimately paid for by a successful business. They were all bought with stolen capital. I explained how Connor had faked vendor contracts and bogus consulting fees to funnel venture capital straight into his personal offshore accounts. He'd been taking money meant for software development and employee payroll to buy Chloe diamonds and import Italian marble for her master bathroom. He had built a grand, towering illusion of a perfect, wealthy white knight brother-in-law. And with a glowing tablet, I was burning that illusion to the ground. Chloe let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound made of pure terror mixed with deeply offended vanity. She whipped her head around and glared at her husband, snapping at him to say something to defend himself. She screamed at him to tell me I was lying, to prove his company was the massive success he always claimed it was. But Connor couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket. He stared down at his lap, completely unable to meet his wife's frantic eyes, His total silence was the loudest confession anyone had ever heard. The illusion was shattered. The family's golden couple had been exposed in an instant as a pair of desperate fraudsters. Orch. In that exact moment, Chloe realized her whole identity, her social standing, and a lifetime of unearned luxury were built entirely on federal-level fraud. The money wasn't real. The status wasn't real. The only real thing was the total disaster staring them right in the face. Orch. She began to gasp for air, clutching at the diamond necklace around her neck as if gripping it tightly enough could somehow protect her stolen assets. She spun away from her husband and looked wildly toward the head of the table, locking eyes with our mother, Valerie, and our father, Winston. Chloe started begging them to do something. Orch. Crying, she pleaded with them to make me shut up, to fix this mess, and make the nightmare go away. She sobbed that I was ruining her life, claiming I was just jealous of her happiness and intentionally trying to destroy her marriage. Even in the face of bulletproof evidence of financial crime, the Golden Girl instinctively played the victim. Orch. Completely ignoring the fact that she was the direct beneficiary of millions in stolen funds, she directed all her rage at the person exposing the truth. My distant relatives watched the total breakdown in complete horror. My aunts and uncles sat paralyzed in their chairs, eyes wide with shock. Orch. The niece they had spent years ignoring, dismissing as a corporate nobody struggling at the bottom, had just methodically dismantled the most powerful man in their family hierarchy. They realized the lavish lifestyle they had so envied and admired was nothing more than a fragile house of cards built on felony embezzlement. The power dynamic of the entire family was permanently, violently flipped. Orch. At the head of the table, Winston's face turned a dangerous, dark shade of purple. My father was a man who demanded total control over everything, insisting the family present an image of flawless perfection to the outside world. For years, he had praised Connor as the ultimate benchmark of success while treating me like a burdensome failure. Orch. Now, he was being forced to watch his prize son-in-law exposed as a pathetic crook. Worse, he was watching the daughter he used as a scapegoat take complete command of the room through absolute authority and wealth beyond his wildest dreams. The humiliation was too much for Winston to bear. His ego couldn't process the brutal reality that he'd backed the wrong horse. Orch. He couldn't accept that the daughter he kicked out at 18, the one he deemed unworthy to work at his logistics company, was holding the axe over their golden family. That intense cognitive dissonance threw fuel on his notoriously explosive temper. Winston's breathing turned heavy and rough. He glared at me, his eyes burning with intense fury. He didn't care about the embezzlement. Orch. He didn't care that Connor had stolen from investors, or that he was facing federal prison time. All he cared about was that I had dared to bring this embarrassment to his dinner table. All he cared about was that I had disrespectfully challenged his authority by proving I was far superior to his chosen favorite. Winston erupted in a sudden flash of rage. Orch. He roared my name, his voice thundering through the upscale restaurant. He slammed his heavy fist onto the white linen tablecloth with terrifying force, sending a shockwave through the solid wood table. Crystal wine glasses toppled instantly, spilling deep red wine across the immaculate fabric like a fresh stain. Orch. The sharp crack of shattering glass rang through the room, making diners at neighboring tables jump and forcing the waitstaff to freeze in their tracks. My father paid no mind to the spilled wine or the broken glass. He leaned aggressively across the ruined table, pointing a shaking, angry finger straight at my face. His voice dropped to a low, threatening growl, dripping with malice. Orch. He told me I thought I'd won. He said I thought I was so smart sitting there with my fancy tablet and my secret company. He sneered, telling me I thought I held all the cards just because I'd caught Connor slipping up. Winston flashed a dark, cruel smile that sent a chill through the room. He leaned in closer, making sure every word hit with deadly weight. Orch. You think you won, Emily, he said, his voice dripping poison. You think you hold all the cards? You just made a fatal mistake. Winston stood over the ruined table, heavy breaths rattling in his chest. The spilled wine dripped slowly off the edge of the white cloth, leaving expensive stains on the carpet. He didn't even look at Connor anymore. Porch. His disgraced son-in-law was completely useless to him now. Winston's sole focus was reclaiming total control over me. Pointing that thick finger at my face, he repeated that I'd made a fatal mistake. He told me that coming into this restaurant to show off my secret venture capital firm was the dumbest move I could have made. Porch. He said I was far too arrogant for a woman who clearly didn't understand how real family loyalty worked. I sat there quietly. I looked up at my father and asked him which kind of loyalty he was referring to. Was it the kind that let Connor embezzle millions to buy my sister luxury sports cars? Winston slammed his hand down on the table again, ordering me to shut my mouth. Porch. He told me Connor's situation was a separate issue, that whatever financial mess Connor made was between him and the federal government. Right then, Winston made it crystal clear. He was more than happy to throw his golden son-in-law to the wolves if it saved his own skin. Chloe buried her face in her hands and sobbed out loud. But my father ignored her entirely. Porch. He turned his dark, furious eyes back onto me. He said I had gotten way too big for my boots, getting comfortable judging the people who gave me life. He told me it was time I learned that parents always hold the ultimate leverage. My mother, Valerie, suddenly stopped comforting Chloe. She looked up at Winston, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Porch. The panic that had consumed her face just minutes ago began to fade. Wiping a tear from her cheek, she stood up and straightened her back. She stepped beside Winston, forming a toxic united front. Looking down at me, a cold, calculating smile crept back onto her face. She told me Winston was absolutely right. Porch. She said. I thought having a big bank account and a fancy title made me invincible. But I was about to learn a very painful lesson on how the real world actually worked. Winston adjusted his suit jacket, regaining his arrogant posture. He looked around the private dining area to make sure all our relatives were watching closely. He needed an audience for what he was about to reveal. Porch. He told me that over 5 years ago, his logistics company hit a massive financial wall. He explained that the industry was changing fast, and his traditional business model was burning money at an alarming rate. He'd been facing complete bankruptcy and the total destruction of the family's wealth. Porch. He desperately needed a massive injection of capital just to keep the business afloat and maintain their high social standing. Winston flashed a dark, predatory smile. Unfortunately, he said, his own credit score had already been destroyed by a series of reckless, failed investments. And my mother had maxed out all her personal lines of credit just to maintain their lavish lifestyle. Porch. They were completely out of options, and traditional banks were threatening to call in their existing loans. They needed a clean record, a financial ghost. They needed someone with an absolute, spotless credit history and zero debt. Valerie let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh, looking at me with pure, unadulterated spite. She told me I'd always been a quiet, boring little girl. Porch. She said that ever since they kicked me out of the house, I'd never asked them for a single dime. I worked 3 jobs, paid rent on a tiny apartment, and meticulously built up a flawless credit score all on my own. She said my financial profile was so spotless because I lived like a pauper. Porch. She told me it was that exact responsible, self-reliant nature that made me the absolute perfect prey for their survival plan. My father leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the back of a chair. With immense pride, he admitted to the whole table that 5 years ago, they stole my social security number. Porch. He said that since they were my parents, getting their hands on my personal information was effortless. He bragged about how they used my clean identity to apply for massive, high-interest commercial loans. They submitted completely forged documents, claiming I was a silent partner in his failing logistics company, forging my signature on dozens of legally binding financial documents. Porch. They put my flawless credit up as collateral to pull out millions of dollars in highly leveraged corporate debt. I sat there silently, listening to my own parents gleefully admit to committing federal identity theft right in front of everyone. I didn't show a hint of surprise or fear. I just let them carry on with their arrogant bragging. Orch. Winston practically glowed as he explained how brilliant their scheme was. He said they secured the millions needed to save the logistics company, using the freshly laundered funds to pay off immediate debts and keep their suburban mansion. Orch. They even used a chunk of the fraudulent loan to fully fund Chloe's lavish destination wedding in the Caribbean, figuring they deserved a proper celebration after surviving a financial crisis. They comfortably enjoyed all the luxury while leaving that massive, crushing debt entirely under my name. Valerie took a step forward, her eyes shining with triumphant delight. Orch. She explained their twisted justification for committing felony fraud against her own daughter. She said I owed them because they brought me into this world. She claimed that since they kept a roof over my head when I was a kid, I was forever in their debt. Using my credit score was just a mandatory family tax. Orch. Since I'd always refused to play by their rules, this was my little contribution to the family. She genuinely believed that stealing her daughter's identity was a completely reasonable parenting strategy. Winston chimed in, adding that they always viewed those fraudulent loans as their ultimate safety net. Orch. He said they knew my independent nature would eventually make me successful, so they planned it out. If the logistics company ever went completely under, they would simply dump the massive debt burden straight onto my shoulders. They believed that to save my own precious credit score, I'd be legally forced to pay off their millions in high-interest loans. Orch. They thought they'd created a flawless trap I couldn't escape. All our relatives sat frozen in their chairs. My aunts and uncles looked completely terrified. They had been fine watching me get pressured into paying for an expensive dinner, but hearing my parents proudly confess to orchestrating a multi-million-dollar federal fraud scheme against their own daughter crossed every line. Orch. They finally realized they were sitting at a table run by actual felons. One aunt tried to speak up, asking if Winston was joking, but the words died in her throat. The sheer malice coming off my parents was suffocating. Standing tall, Winston felt completely empowered. He glanced down at the iPad still sitting quietly on the table. Orch. He said he didn't care how much money my VC firm managed, or if I had the power to ruin Connor. He was convinced that because my personal name was tied to their massive commercial loans, he held the ultimate leverage to force my complete submission. He thought he could use my stolen identity to command and control my wealth. Valerie walked around the table until she was just feet from my chair. Orch. Looking down at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure arrogance. She believed she had pushed her least favorite daughter into checkmate, reclaiming her status as the untouchable matriarch of the family. Her fake, sweet motherly voice was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. Tilting her head with a sneer, confidence flashed in her eyes. Orch. Crossing her arms over her expensive designer dress, she delivered her final threat. She spoke slowly, making sure every single word landed with maximum impact. You're carrying millions of dollars in debt under your name right now, Emily. Her voice cut clearly through the silent room. The moment we stop making those payments, you lose everything. Orch. That vicious threat hung heavy in the air over the ruined dinner table. My mother stood there, her chest heaving under her dress as she caught her breath. She truly believed she had just delivered the knockout blow. She waited expectantly to see my composure shatter into a million unfixable pieces, waiting for the color to drain from my face, and tears of absolute defeat to spill over. Orch. She wanted me to realize that even with billions in venture capital at my disposal, even having built a massive empire, I was still completely at her mercy, like a servant. Winston stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder, with his wife like a wall. Gripping the back of a chair, he looked down at me with cold, calculating eyes, like a mob boss preparing for a ruthless corporate takeover. Torch. He told me Valerie was spot on. My prestigious position as the CEO of a powerful VC firm relied entirely on maintaining an immaculate public and financial record. He understood the rules of the American venture capital ecosystem. He knew institutional investors, pension funds, and university endowments required rigorous background checks before handing over hundreds of millions of dollars. Torch. Winston smiled, his teeth gleaming under the chandelier. With the casual arrogance of a blackmailer issuing a final ultimatum, he laid out his full list of demands. He told me that if I wanted to protect my firm and keep my reputation intact, I had to follow his orders to the letter. Torch. First, he commanded me to immediately use Apex Vanguard funds to inject a massive wave of clean capital into Connor's failing startup. I had to package the transfer as a strategic Series C investment, using the fresh capital to quietly fill the multi-million-dollar hole Connor had created through his embezzlement. Torch. He ordered me to restructure the internal books so federal investigators would never find a trace of mismanaged funds. Connor, who had been slumped in his chair in terror, suddenly shifted. Realizing my parents were aggressively blackmailing me to save his skin, gave his fragile ego a desperate shot of confidence. Torch. Wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead, he actually had the nerve to adjust his silk tie. Looking over at me, his chest puffed out slightly on the back of my parents' scheme. He had the nerve to call it a standard corporate bailout, telling me that as family, I had a fiduciary duty to protect the family name from public scandal. Torch. He added that injecting a few million into his company was a small price to pay to keep everyone out of federal prison. Ignoring Connor entirely, my father continued reading off his long list of demands. Saving his golden son-in-law was only step one. Winston dictated that I also had to personally assume full responsibility for all the fraudulent commercial loans they'd taken out in my name. Torch. He noted that I had more than enough liquid wealth to pay off the millions in high-interest debt all at once, ordering me to wire the full amount directly to his logistics company account by the end of the week. Torch. He shamelessly framed it as a mandatory retirement package, claiming that once I cleared their massive debt and funded Connor, they would generously allow me to return to my quiet, anonymous life and never bother me again. Valerie chimed in, her voice dripping with sickening sweet poison. Torch. She called it a perfect solution for everyone. Chloe gets to keep her beautiful suburban home, her designer bags, and her luxury cars. Connor avoids a federal indictment and maintains his image as a brilliant tech founder, and my parents get to retire in luxury, free from the burden of a failing business. Torch. She smiled warmly, as if planning a lovely family vacation instead of blackmailing her own daughter for millions. All I needed to do, she said, was pull out my checkbook and comply. In a flat, emotionless voice, I asked them, "And what happens if I simply refuse your generous offer?" Winston let out a sharp, aggressive laugh and slapped the wooden chair back. He told me refusal wasn't an option. Torch. With gloating precision, he mapped out the splash zone of the financial bomb they were ready to detonate. If I didn't agree to all their terms right here and now, they would intentionally default on every single commercial loan tied to my social security number at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Torch. A massive, sudden default of that size would instantly trigger automatic red flags across every major credit bureau in the country. Leaning in closer, his voice dropped to a rough, menacing whisper. He told me those credit alerts would immediately notify the SEC and the Independent Compliance Board overseeing my VC firm. Torch. Millions in defaulted, fraudulent business debt coming to light would cause me to fail mandatory federal background checks instantly. He swore that my position as a high-powered executive would be permanently, violently ruined before I even finished my morning coffee. They genuinely believed they had me trapped in an inescapable corner. Chloe suddenly stopped crying. Torch. Looking up with smudged mascara, her expression hardened back into the toxic entitlement defined by our parents. She looked at me, demanding I agree to the deal immediately. She claimed I had more money than I could ever spend and that I owed her, saying I had to fix this mess. She put the blame for exposing the embezzlement entirely on me, claiming none of this unpleasantness would be happening if I had just stayed away. She ordered me to stop being selfish and use my secret company to save her husband, so she wouldn't face the humiliation of losing her country club membership. I sat in my chair in complete silence, letting their stunning delusion echo across the table. The quiet, elegant hum of the restaurant continued around us, completely detached from the absolute madness taking place in our private area. My distant relatives, the aunts and uncles witnessing this horror show, looked physically sick. They stared at my parents as if watching two people tear off human masks to reveal the real monsters underneath. They finally realized my parents weren't just strict, biased parents who favored one child. They were cold-blooded, calculating criminals willing to destroy their own flesh and blood to maintain a fake image of wealth. I didn't break down. I didn't look scared at all. I didn't drop to my knees to beg for my father's mercy, nor did I plead with my mother to spare my professional reputation. I just watched them. I noted the arrogant set of Winston's chin. I saw the vicious, greedy spark in Valerie's eyes. I caught the desperate, pathetic relief washing over Connor's sweat-streaked face. They had such bizarre confidence in their crude, primitive blackmail tactics. They naively thought they could manipulate the founder of a multi-million-dollar financial institution, using the same bullying tactics they used on me when I was an insecure teenager under their roof. A very slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of surrender or defeat. It was a smile of pure, clinical mockery. Realizing just how foolish they were, and how out of their depth they truly were, was almost intoxicating. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence, and tonight that fatal flaw was going to cost them everything they held. Dear. I slowly pushed my chair back a bit to give myself room. I reached down to the floor where my structured black leather briefcase had been sitting quietly all evening. With a smooth, steady motion, I unzipped the main compartment. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I didn't pull out a pen to sign over my firm's capital. Instead, I reached in and firmly pulled out a thick, neatly bound stack of heavy manila legal files. I lifted the heavy documents and set them down squarely on the only dry spot of the white linen cloth not soaked in wine. The heavy files hit the table with a dull thud, making Connor flinch in his seat. The arrogant sneers on my parents' faces stiffened just a fraction, quickly replaced by a sudden, creepy sense of unease. They stared at the legal documents, their brains frantically trying to process why the daughter they thought they'd just successfully blackmailed was looking back at them with absolute terrifying confidence. I placed both hands flat on the crisp manila folder. Looking straight into my father's dark, angry eyes, I shifted my glance over to my mother's suddenly tense face. I let the suffocating silence stretch for a few painful seconds, making sure I had their absolute, undivided attention. Then I spoke, my voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with lethal authority. Did you really think that before launching a multi-hundred-million-dollar venture capital fund, I wouldn't run the most thorough, deep-dive background check on myself first? The question echoed in our private dining room, hanging in the air with the sharp horror of a newly drawn blade. My mother, Valerie, stopped breathing entirely, her chest freezing mid-gasp. The malicious, triumphant spark in her eyes vanished in a single instant. Beside her, my father, Winston, gripped the back of the chair so hard that his knuckles turned stark white against his dark skin. They spent my whole life treating me like a naive, obedient child, convinced they could effortlessly pull my strings just by yelling louder or cutting me off financially. In all their unbelievable arrogance, it never crossed their minds that a woman managing hundreds of millions in institutional capital would have security and compliance systems more powerful than most government agencies. Ouch. I didn't even wait for them to stumble through another pathetic excuse. Reaching across the immaculate white linen, I deliberately steered clear of the spreading wine stain. Pressing my manicured hand against the first manila legal folder from my briefcase, I slid it smoothly across the table until it landed right in front of Winston. Ouch. Then, I slid the second identical file over until it bumped the edge of Valerie's silver charger plate. Leaning back in my chair, I crossed my legs with absolute poise and rested my hands on my knee. I watched them stare at those closed folders as if I'd just handed them 2 live grenades with the pins pulled out. Ouch. Winston was a man who demanded total control over every deal he touched, but right now his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He reached out and slowly peeled open the cover of the heavy cardstock folder. Valerie hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before following suit, her movements stiff and jerky as she dragged her file closer. Ouch. I kept my voice dead steady, letting a cold clinical authority pour over that silent, panic-stricken table like ice water. I told them that 8 months ago, Apex Vanguard was getting ready to launch our 3rd major regional investment fund. Ouch. I explained that whenever a venture firm builds a fund of that scale, federal regulators mandate the most exhaustive, deep-dive background checks on every single managing partner and executive. I told them how my chief compliance officer, a sharp, relentless former federal prosecutor, walked into my corner office holding a thick, deeply unsettling file. Ouch. I kept my eyes locked on Winston as his gaze darted frantically across the first page of the document. I announced to the entire table that my compliance team had uncovered a massive, high-stakes web of corporate debt tied directly and securely to my personal Social Security number. Ouch. I laid out the sickened, gut-wrenching betrayal I felt when my compliance officer first showed me those loan initiation forms. Looking straight at my mother, I told her what it was like sitting in my office, staring at dozens of legally binding financial contracts I had never seen before, all bearing horribly forged copies of my signature. Ouch. I exposed the sheer laziness and unbelievable arrogance behind their criminal scheme. They had the nerve to forge my signature for millions in subprime business loans, yet they were too lazy to even use a different address, plugging in Winston's failing logistics company as the primary contact. Ouch. They'd put up my flawless credit as collateral with predatory lenders because every reputable bank in Georgia had permanently blacklisted Winston for his reckless financial messes. Chloe let out a faint, terrified whimper, slapping both hands over her mouth. She was finally starting to grasp the catastrophic crimes our parents committed just to fund her unearned luxury. Ouch. Looking right at my sister, I told her that our parents had literally mortgaged my identity and my entire financial future just so she could throw an absurdly lavish destination wedding in the Caribbean. And so Connor could get desperate seed money to plug the holes in his fraudulent startup. They stole my name to feed her golden lifestyle. Then I shifted my focus back to my parents. Ouch. I watched the color completely drain from their faces as they realized the sheer scope of what they were facing. "Did you really think?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper that cut through the room. "That I wouldn't notice a paper trail involving my own identity?" Winston tried to speak, his lips moving without making a sound. Ouch. The proud, dominating patriarch of the family looked suddenly broken, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that the leverage he thought he held was nothing more than an illusion. "You thought you were setting a trap for me," I continued. Leaning forward slightly, my eyes locked on Valerie, who was now trembling visibly. "You thought you could hold this debt over my head like a leash. Ouch. But you forgot one tiny, crucial detail." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. The moment my compliance team flagged those loans, we didn't just investigate them. We secured every piece of evidence, mapped every transaction, and turned the entire file over to federal authorities. The room seemed to drop several degrees. Ouch. Valerie's jaw went slack, and Connor looked as though he might throw up right onto the table. "The federal investigation isn't coming," I said smoothly, a cold, unwavering smile touching my lips. "It's already finished.